Hi, I'm Doug from Dynamic Computing, and welcome to episode 119 of 10-Minute Amiga Retrocast. Now, last week I introduced you to my bright, shiny new Amiga 500 that's entered my family. Here's a nice picture of it here. Take a look at the video right there if you've not seen that introduction to my new Amiga. Well, this nice machine is gorgeous, but it still had the original OCS chipset from the late 80s. So it was missing out on some of the features that the more modern ECS or enhanced chipset graphics chips could handle on our loving Amiga line. We're going to remedy that today and give this girl a new lease on life and drag her kicking and screaming into the early 90s. Wouldn't you love to go back there? When the Amiga 1000 came out, I mean, it was absolutely beyond anything anyone had ever seen. But when the Amiga 500 and the Amiga 2000 replaced it in around 86, 87, they brought along most of the features of the Amiga 1000 chipset without too many enhancements. Denise was pretty much the same as in the Amiga 1000. Paul and Gary stayed exactly the same. And Agnes did change, and she went from a DIP style package to the square PLCC package that we know and love today, and we're going to take a look at in a minute. The first generation of the PLCC Agnus were lovingly called the Fat Agnus because she had more addressing space, so she was Fat Agnus. Cute name, stuck for years. Now both were still limited to 512 kilobytes of chip RAM, but Fat Agnus could address more memory than original Agnus could. See, it could see an additional 512 kilobytes on the motherboard, whether it was an Amiga 2000 or a belly slot memory card in Amiga 500. And it sort of saw it as fast RAM. It did not see it as chip RAM. It was slower than fast RAM because of how it had to be addressed through the Agnus. So we called that in the States, lovingly called it half-assed RAM. It's also known as slow fast RAM, or in some circles they called it Ranger RAM, I believe. I think the 8370 Agnus, the one that shipped on the first generation of Amiga 500s and 2000s, was probably considered by Commodore to be a stopgap solution, and I think they had it in their heads that they were going to be moving beyond 512K of chip RAM fairly quickly. The ECS Chipset was released by Commodore to the world in 1990 with the release of the Amiga 3000 computer. I have a great review of my Amiga 3000 right here. I love that machine. Now, not long after that, they released ECS upgrade chips for the Amiga 500 and the Amiga 2000. Now, there were probably some Amiga 500s and Amiga 2000s in probably 1989 that shipped with at least the ECS Agnus chip, maybe not the Denise, but I think those were really the exception rather than the rule, and it really didn't become popular until at least 1990. Now, let's go over what needs to be done to upgrade your machine from OCS to ECS, like we're going to do right here. Come on down. Now this little beauty right here is the 8372A Agnus chip, sometimes called obese Agnus or fatter Agnus. It's a bit different than the 8372 Agnus chip, which is this guy right here, that came on the Amiga 3000, in that this one can only address 1 megabyte of chip RAM, where the 8372B can address 2 megabytes of chip RAM. Now, you can use the 8372B on an Amiga 500 or an Amiga 2000, but you need a special adapter that gets some additional signals from the Gary chip. Now, I use the Mega chip on two of my systems to give me 2 megs of RAM on a couple of my Amiga 500 and Amiga 2000s. But Jens from Individual Computers sells something called the ACE2B adapter. And here's a picture of it right there. And what that does is that's got 2 megs on board. And then it actually replaces the motherboard memory and the belly socket memory and uses its own memory for chip RAM. Interesting little beast. Now there's also an adapter that's available that you can build yourself, and I'll put a link to the GitHub right in the description. Now, I'd build one myself, but I would probably burn my house down. So this is the original 8370 Agnus chip that's in here right now, and I'm just going to use my little tool, which is this little guy right here, to get down in there and just pull her straight up and pop it out. Now you want to be careful removing your Agnus, and you don't want to bend any pins or break the thing, so don't use like a screwdriver to pry it up. Now many Amiga 500 motherboards, if you take the motherboard out of the case, there's actually two holes underneath the Agnus that are designed to poke up some kind of little, like a wooden dowel through, pop the little chip right out. But I've got a tool to do it. So here's our little tool. It's got two little whatchamajiggers that go right under it, and then just pull her straight up, and usually she just pops right out. So we'll take that out, put it aside, and we'll put in our little honey right here. Now you'll notice these have a little angled notch in one corner, and that lines up with the angled notch in the bottom right hand corner of the chip. So it is absolutely possible to put these things in upside down in the wrong way. So just be careful and line up the little notches and pay attention to how you remove it in the first place. That's it for installing the actual Agnus chip. Now let's look at what we need to do next. Now we're going to have to do a minor modification to get the Rev 5 board here, and most Rev 6 boards, to see 1 megabyte of chip RAM with a new fat Agnus. If we just turned it on right now, we would literally just still see 512K of chip RAM. Now what we're looking for is the Jp2 pads, which are they're right here on a Rev 5 board. Now they may be in a different location on a Rev 6 board or a Rev 3 board, but you're looking for Jp2. Now see right here between pads 2 and 3, there's a bridge between them, that little silver bridge. We have to break that bridge. So what we would do is we would take like an X-Acto knife and just scrape right there very carefully and break that bridge between pads 2 and 3. Then we would take a soldering iron, and easiest way is just to put a nice little glob of solder right there on pin 1, and then heat it up and drag the solder over to pin 2 here, to pad 2, to bridge 1 and 2. So you're getting rid of that bridge, you're adding a bridge between those two. That whole thing should take you about 5 minutes. There's a reason I'm not doing it right now though. Next, over by our belly slot RAM expansion, there's a trace that's called JP7A, and it is this little guy right here. This trace here, see it goes up there, so look for that trace. You're just going to want to cut right here with your X-Acto and make sure that that trace is no longer through. This is something that detects the memory that's set in the belly slot, and that needs to be cut and disabled. So two things: slice this here, change JP6 or JP2 over here, and we're good to go. Like I said, there's a reason that I've not cut the traces or soldered on mine, which I'll get to in a second. But let's talk about what else our Agnus will do besides just give us 1 meg of chip RAM, which in and of itself is awesome. Agnus also has the ability to easily switch between Ntsc, which is of course the vastly superior method of displaying, and the PAL mode. Just kidding, guys, just kidding. Now, in the past, on an Amiga 500 or 2000, your Ntsc machine was Ntsc. It's not going to display PAL. Your PAL machine was PAL. It was not going to display Ntsc. With the ECS chipset, you can switch between them by booting your Amiga, holding both mouse button downs. I call it the two mouse button salute. And then in a display that we're going to see here in a few minutes, you're able to hit the space bar. It switches from Ntsc to PAL. Hit it again, PAL to Ntsc. It's as easy as that to switch between it. And there are some PAL games that just won't play on an Ntsc system at all. There are some where the bottom's just cut off and they're worthless. The sound and the speed is wrong. But you do this Ntsc to PAL switching with the ECS chips, most of those problems go away. Now you really need Amiga OS 2.x or above to easily access these features, but there are tools available for Workbench 1.3 that will allow you to switch between the modes on the EC if you have an ECS machine. Now our next upgrade is this lovely Ntsc chip. This is the 8374 R4. Now the original Ntsc chips were the 8363. They had an R3 and an R5 and an R8. There are a couple differences between the two. You can look up and see what those differences are. But this is the ECS version, the R4. And luckily enough, this is literally just pop out the old chip, pop in the new chip replacement. There is no soldering or anything else you need to do. So let's go ahead and get the old one out and put the new one in. And out with the old. I'll just use this little prying tool to get it up. I do have one of those chip pullers, but they're more for ROM chips, and they're a little bit too short for the Ntsc chips. So we'll just carefully pop that out, and of course we'll match up the little notches, and we will carefully put our new Ntsc in, and that's it. You're upgraded to a full ECS machine with a new ECS Agnus and a new ECS Ntsc with just a couple minor modifications and popping in 2 chips. Let's take a look at what this can do for us, and let's figure out why I did not cut any of the traces on my Amiga 500. Now let's take a look at why I did not modify my Amiga physically. So you guys know from the last episode that I'm currently using this with an ACA 500 Plus. Take a look at what we can do from the ACA 500 Plus menu. We're going to hit F10 to go into the settings. Now look at this setting down here, F5 1 megabyte chip RAM expansion, off or on. If I switch this to on right here, it will automatically detect the new Agnus. It will automatically map the 1 megabyte of chip RAM without having to make the physical modifications. That is cool. So you just choose that and you hit save and you let it boot up your Workbench, which is kind of cool. Now, there are reasons for me to want to do the permanent modification, which I am going to do. Now, the reason is I have multiple accelerators for my Amiga 500. I've got my classic 520, which you'll see a review for right up there. And I've also got my Amiga A570 CD-ROM, which is a really, really nice CD-ROM that gives my Amiga full CD capabilities. And I'll also put a link to that video right there. Both of those, if I use them, would only see the 512K of chip RAM because I hadn't done the physical modification. But look here, with my beautiful little ACA 500 Plus, look at that up at the top. 1 megabyte of chip RAM, 5 megabytes of fast RAM. It's 7, and then you had a little bit of memory used by the Amiga OS 3.2 operating system. Pretty cool, huh? Now you'll notice that I actually am using a nice Ntsc multi-sync 1970 monitor for display here instead of the 1084 that came with this particular Amiga. And there's a reason for that. Number one, I want to show you these new screen modes, and they're not going to work on a 1084. And number two, the capture of the actual live monitor doesn't have all the little lines running down when you work with an LCD display. But a lot of these new modes do work on a 1084, just not all of them. Now I'm hooking this up to the LCD monitor using Eduarana's 23-pin to VGA adapter, which I will show a picture of right there. Commodore also made a nice one back in the day. 23 on one side, the 15-pin VGA on the other side. These work fine too. Under the OCS chipset, you were going to be limited to a couple of resolutions. 320 by 200, 320 by 400, 640 by 200, and 640 by 400. Those are the four resolutions you could use. And of course, they were more pixels when you enable overscan, like here, 724 by 480. But those are the standard ones. If you were in PAL mode, which the OCS on my machine would not have supported. You're going to have modes like 320 by 256, 640 by 256, and then the same modes with 512 vertical pixels. One of the most important things that I mentioned earlier is now with the ECS chipset, we can switch between Ntsc and PAL on a whim. We reboot the system. I'm holding down both mouse buttons. Now it's going to take me to this early boot up menu right here with the 2 mouse button salute. Look here, press space key to toggle between PAL and Ntsc. Hit space, boom, she goes into PAL mode. Space again, boom, she goes back into Ntsc mode. That easy. It's really cool. You can also hit display options here and choose your mode here, Ntsc or PAL. And you can also switch between the original chipset or the enhanced chipset. You'd choose original if you have some game that absolutely refuses to work under the enhanced chipset. Click this on original, chances are it might work. We're going to go ahead and boot into PAL mode. And then now that we're booted up into PAL mode, when we go into our screen modes prefs, we can literally just choose a nice PAL mode here. Here's a nice high-res mode, 4-color. And it comes up just fine. It looks a little different, and sometimes we need to adjust the overscan settings depending on what monitor we're using. And it looks like I have to do that. Yep, but then we can come up with a PAL mode, assuming your monitor supports it. Pretty cool, huh? Now we're back in good old Ntsc land, but that's not all the ECS chipset provides for you. The ability to switch between PAL and Ntsc, and the ability to have 1 megabyte of chip RAM. Take a look at some of these other awesome Denise modes that are now available. We now have a super high res mode. This is natively a 1280 by 200 mode with overscan 1440 by 240. Take a look at this mode here. Boom. And you have a really wide mode now, 1440 pixels across. We can then go in here, switch it to overscan or into interlace mode, and it will become a flickery mess that's hard to see, but an absolutely usable display. Look at all that screen real estate here. We can just have icons and things open left and right up here, and the Amiga just handles it just beautifully. Take a look at these modes. These are the multi-scan modes. This is multi-scan productivity. This is basically 640 by 480. This is going to be in 4 colors, which I'll explain to you in a second. When you use these multi-scan modes, you are now in 640 by 480 pixels, rock solid, not one single iota of flicker on the screen. You can see we've got everything on here and not a drop of flicker on the screen. And it's actually pretty fast. This is a 68,000 running at 21 megahertz. So if you've got any kind of acceleration at all, these modes are really plenty fast, and they look so rock solid on your Workbench screen. Now, all of these modes, these enhanced modes, are called productivity modes. And the reason they're called productivity modes is they're designed mainly for business software, because they chop the palette, the color palette, from 4,096 colors down to only 64 colors, of which you can use either 2 or 4 at a time. And it does that for bandwidth reasons. It just doesn't have the guts and the horsepower to handle 4,096 colors in these enhanced modes. We also have these modes called double Ntsc. So here's a low resolution, there's double PAL, sorry. Low res, no flicker. We're going to take a look at what Workbench looks like in low res, but non-interlaced. Look at that, rock solid, not a drop of interlace in there. And we can do high res, no flicker. These are going to be very similar to the multi-scan modes, but slightly different. And again, not a drop of flicker, nice and fast. 4 colors out of 64 usable in this mode. Now, the way these multi-scan modes is really kind of genius. The way that they work is really genius. What they do is you have a 640 by 240 mode, okay? You double scan that, it changes it into a 320 by 480 31.5 kilohertz mode, which is just absolutely crazy. It's at 29 kilohertz, but pretty close. If you want 640 by 480 like multi-scan here, it takes a 1280 by 240 screen and halves the horizontal resolution, doubles the vertical, and that therefore brings it up to a 31.44 kilohertz mode, rock solid. So it's really a clever way to do it. Now, there are some other modes that are less common but still really cool. The issue is most monitors don't support it. Here's Super 72. This is a 640 by 600. No, I'm sorry, 456 by 600 image. But look what happens if we do super high res. This is an 800 by 600 workbench screen on an Amiga 500. All right, now, but look at this freaky scan rate here, 24.62 kilohertz. There's not many monitors on earth that can handle that. Luckily, my multi-scan here can, so I can show you the mode, but this is an actual 800 by 600 workbench. That's right there. Pretty cool, Hunter, isn't it? 800 by 600 workbench. Again, we've got her set to 4 colors. So what are these new modes good for? We're talking 64 colors with only 4 displayable at one time, but rock solid interlace modes. These are great for having your workbench on a nice VGA monitor, rock solid. If you've got a monitor that can handle both 15 and 31 kilohertz, you do your workbench stuff in these rock solid modes. You use a mode promotion utility like a new mode to promote your software to these rock solid modes. So you're doing your word processing at 640 by 480 or even 800 by 600 if your particular monitor supports it. Then when you want to play a video game, you put a video game in there. It works at 15 kilohertz, 320 by 200, 320 by 256, depending on whether it's Ntsc or PAL. Works fine, no problems at all. So it really enhances the productivity aspect. Now, you're not going to be drawing pictures in these modes for the most part, although there are some really cool things you can do with the modes. Like in the 1440 by 480 modes, the really, really high resolution ones, it's wonderful for making text for videos, for doing video titling, because it's so sharp. And you don't need lots of colors for that. You need like white text or maybe 1 or 2 colors or some shadows. It works fantastic for video titling. So they absolutely have their uses. Now, that's not all ECS adds. It also adds a little better sprite support, handles sprites a little better. It handles blitting. Instead of 1K by 1K areas, the blitter can blit. It's now 32K by 32K that it can blit. So it makes scrolling smoother, scrolling faster, theoretically, by being able to blit larger areas of memory at one time, which is kind of cool. It also makes creating virtual screens easier and more efficient. So if you want to create a 1024 by 1024 workbench, display it on a 640 by 40 screen, and then scroll around and have things in different areas, no problems at all with ECS. Now, I need ECS mainly for the chip RAM. I love to run lots of programs at once, love to run graphics programs, and with a meg of chip RAM, you can have several graphics or audio programs open simultaneously without worrying about running out of memory like you would with 512K of chip RAM. I generally use other solutions for deinterlacing my displays. Like I'll often use my SCART to or my RGB to SCART cable going into my SCART to HDMI box, which I reviewed right here. Mr. Cola also helped me with that upscale review. Thanks, buddy. But I do use these non-interlaced high-resolution displays quite frequently. I've used them in my Amiga 2000s. I'm going to be using them with this machine right here, which is going to be a lot of fun. Now, after using AGA and using my Amiga 3000 for so long, I feel hobbled on an OCS machine. I honestly do. When I hook this little guy up and I got Workbench 3.2 loaded and I'm like, and I can't get more than 512K of chip RAM, and I can't get to these display modes. It feels hobbled. So I popped out and I got myself a nice little Agnus chip and a Ntsc chip, and now she's working like a champ in ECS. And I think you should too. Big thanks to my wonderful patrons who you see scrolling across the screen of this beautiful 1440 by 480 picture that I converted into 4 beautiful colors. If you'd like to join this prestigious group for as little as $2 a month, pop on over to patreon.com/10mark and you can be part of this list too. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for joining me today in this quick exploration of the ECS chipset. I hope you learned something. Please like and subscribe and comment below and tell me how you used ECS back in the day, or even tell me you never bothered to upgrade and you're still using an OCS machine. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram. I would appreciate that. The links are in the description. But until next time, this is Doug from 10 Minute Amiga Retrocast, signing out.